1945. The Third Reich lies in ruins. As Allied forces sweep through Germany, the world focuses on bringing Nazi leaders to justice. But what happened to the women who stood beside them? The wives of Hitler's inner circle faced vastly different fates. Some escaped justice entirely, others spent years in prison, and a few met tragic ends alongside their husbands. Today, we're exploring the untold stories of these women and how they navigated life after one of history's darkest chapters. Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Magda was once considered the First Lady of the Third Reich, a devoted Nazi who believed completely in Hitler's vision. As Berlin fell in April 1945, she made a horrifying decision that would define her legacy forever. Rather than flee or surrender, Magda chose to remain in Hitler's bunker with her 6 young children. On May 1, 1945, just one day after Hitler's suicide, she systematically poisoned each of her children, ranging in age from 4 to 12 years old, with cyanide capsules. Shortly after, both she and Joseph took their own lives. Magda left behind letters attempting to justify her actions, claiming she couldn't imagine her children living in a world without National Socialism. Her story stands as one of the most disturbing examples of ideological fanaticism, and unlike the other wives we'll discuss, she never faced the question of how to rebuild after the war, because she chose not to survive it. Now let's turn to Emmy Göring, the actress wife of Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe. Emmy's post-war experience was dramatically different. When the Allies captured Hermann, Emmy was also arrested and spent over a year in detention, from 1945 to 1946. She was eventually released and lived quietly in Munich for the rest of her life. Unlike some of the other wives, Emmy never publicly renounced Nazism. She wrote a memoir defending her husband and downplaying his role in Nazi atrocities, painting him as a misunderstood military man rather than a war criminal. Hermann Göring famously escaped execution by taking cyanide just hours before his scheduled hanging at Nuremberg in 1946, leaving Emmy a widow. She survived on a modest pension and died in 1973 at age 80, having spent nearly 3 decades as the unapologetic widow of one of history's most notorious figures. Her daughter Edda, born in 1938, became the godchild of Hitler himself and spent much of her life defending her father's legacy. Margarete Himmler, wife of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, had a considerably different experience. Her marriage to the architect of the Holocaust had already been strained for years before the war ended, as Himmler had openly kept a mistress with whom he had 2 children. When Himmler was captured by British forces in May 1945, he committed suicide using a cyanide capsule before he could be brought to trial. Margarete was arrested and spent several years being interrogated by Allied authorities. However, she was eventually released without being charged with any crimes. She lived in quiet obscurity in Munich under her maiden name, working to support herself. Margarete maintained a low profile and rarely spoke publicly about her past. She expressed some regret about the Nazi regime in private conversations, but never made any major public statements. She died in 1967, having lived 22 years after the war ended, largely forgotten by history, a stark contrast to the infamy of her husband. Lina Heydrich was married to Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, and the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart. Heydrich was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942, making Lina a widow even before the war ended. After Germany's defeat, Lina was arrested and spent several years in various detention camps. She was released in 1948 and returned to Germany, where she opened a boarding house on Fehmarn Island in the Baltic Sea. This is where her story takes a controversial turn. Lina never renounced her Nazi beliefs. In fact, she remained a committed Nazi until her death in 1985. Her boarding house became an informal meeting place for unrepentant former SS officers and Nazi sympathizers. She gave interviews defending her husband's actions and the Nazi regime, showing no remorse for the millions who died in the Holocaust that her husband helped orchestrate. She even published a memoir painting Reinhard as a loving family man, conveniently omitting his role in genocide. Lina Heydrich represents perhaps the most troubling category of Nazi wives, those who survived into old age without ever accepting the reality of what their husbands had done. Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, had a unique situation. She was a fanatical Nazi herself, perhaps even more devoted to the ideology than her husband. Together they had 10 children, whom Gerda raised with strict Nazi principles. When Berlin fell, Martin Bormann disappeared. For decades, his fate remained unknown, spawning conspiracy theories that he had escaped to South America. Gerda, however, didn't live to see this mystery resolved. She died of cancer in March 1946, less than a year after the war ended, at just 36 years old. Her children were left orphaned, their father missing and presumed dead, their mother gone. Martin Bormann's remains were eventually discovered in Berlin in 1972, confirming he had died during the attempted escape from the city in May 1945. But Gerda's story reminds us that the collapse of the Nazi regime destroyed not just the perpetrators, but entire families, leaving children to grapple with the horrific legacy of their parents. Ilse Hess had perhaps the longest and strangest vigil of any Nazi wife. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, had been Hitler's deputy, but flew to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre solo peace mission, where he was immediately captured and imprisoned. Ilse wouldn't see her husband again as a free man. After the war, Rudolf Hess was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau prison in Berlin. For the next 46 years, Ilse dedicated her life to campaigning for his release. She wrote letters, gave interviews, and lobbied governments, always maintaining that her husband was a man of peace who had been trying to end the war. Rudolf Hess died in Spandau in 1987 at age 93, the prison's last inmate. Ilse outlived him by 8 years, dying in 1995 at age 96. She spent nearly half a century as the wife of a prisoner, never wavering in her loyalty or her belief that he had been treated unjustly. To the end, she couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the criminal nature of the regime her husband had helped build. The stories of these women reveal how differently individuals navigated the aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse. Some, like Magda Goebbels, chose death over a world without Hitler. Others, like Emmy Göring and Lina Heydrich, lived for decades never accepting their husband's guilt. A few, like Margarete Himmler, retreated into obscurity. What's striking is how few expressed genuine remorse or understanding of the magnitude of the crimes their husbands committed. Most maintained some version of denial, whether claiming ignorance of the Holocaust or defending their husbands as misunderstood patriots. These women were not innocent bystanders. Many were true believers in Nazi ideology who benefited from their privileged positions while millions suffered. Their post-war lives raise difficult questions about complicity, denial, and how societies deal with the families of those who commit atrocities. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II history.